Yes, hello, meet with Sandenani from Edukea Company. I proceed with our topic of establishment of colonialism in Africa, and now we proceed with where I end with methods or tactics or ways which colonialists used to establish colonial rule in Africa. So colonialists used various methods or ways in establishing colonial rule in Africa. So there are various ways or methods or tactics employed or used by colonialists to impose or to establish colonial rule in Africa. And those ways or methods are as follows. Firstly was diplomacy method or signing of treaties. Here, colonialists signed a bogus treaty or false treaty or fake treaty with African chiefs or leaders in order to occupy their land instead or for the benefits of the colonialists. For example, Karl Peters of Germany signed a lot of these bogus treaty, as he signed this treaty with Chief Mangungo of Morogoro in order to occupy their land. So out of this diplomatic method or signing of bogus treaty, another way was the use of force or military conquest or violence method. So here in this method, colonialists went directly to the Africans and used the force to rule them or to establish their colonial rule. Again, another was alliance or collaboration method. In here, colonialists made friendship with the African tribes, which was soft, in order to defeat the strongly African societies. For example, in Tanganyika, Germany collaborated with the Chaga in order to defeat Hehe, who seemed to be very strongly in opposing or resisting them in order to occupy that land of Hehe. Another system was administrative technique, for example through direct rule, indirect rule, and assimilation policy or method. But the other method was ideological method. Example, introduction of Western education, Western civilization, racism, and introduction of Christianity. So colonialists introduced all this in order to establish or in order to control African colonies. Other method was the use of infrastructures and communication media. That is to say colonialists favored Africans in terms of infrastructures and communication media. Again, they made economic technique. For example, destruction of industries, particularly they destroyed the African local industries. And this was done by importing manufactured goods from abroad. For example, clothes, beads, wine, those looking mirror, and other goods which were imported by colonialists from Europe to Africa. So these are methods or techniques which used by colonialists in introducing or establishing colonial rule in Africa. So after establishing colonial rule in Africa, the next part is African resistances or African reactions against the imposition of colonial rule in Africa. So let us now proceed with those African resistances or reactions against the imposition of colonial rule. So African reaction against the imposition of colonial rule. So this is African reaction against the imposition of colonial rule. So despite of colonialists to use different rules or methods or techniques in order to impose or to establish colonial rule, still during imposition of colonial rule in Africa, Africans reacted or opposed the colonialism because Africans were not ready to be under colonial control. That is why Africans imposed the different reactions against the colonialists. That is to say, Africans started to react against the imposition of colonial rule. And this was through different ways or groups of reactions. So ways or group of reactions. There were two ways of reactions against imposition of colonial rule, and these were collaboration or alliance, and another was through resistance. So these two groups of reactions against imposition of colonial rule depend on the following. So firstly was the nature of African reaction against the colonial rule. For example, the military structure and the strengths of the society. So whether the society, how much the society was structured in a military and how much were strengthened. The nature of leadership, for example, is that leader strong or weak? That is to say, a strong leader made that reaction in form of resistances, while the weak one made collaboration in order to get support so that they can fight together. Again, the nature of the colonialist, how the colonialist was, whether they were aggressive or friendly. So for those who were aggressive, that is to say they were harsh, aggressive in nature. That's why Africans made resistances. They resisted them strongly, while those who were friendly, Africans had nothing to react against them. That is why they made just like collaboration. Also, the nature of exploitation and oppression made Africans to use collaboration or resistances. The nature of exploitation that was done, was it too or at the moderate level? And the other, the level of interference in social, political, and economic interest made Africans to react or not. So how much did the social, political, and economic interest made by Europeans, whether those were the same to the African social, economic, and political interest or not? So for those societies or colonies where a colonialist made those social, political, and economic interests of Africans, there were no resistances. But where a colonialist failed, then African reacted. And the other was the nature of population or African societies. For example, the size of the population, unity among the people, and so forth. For example, for those societies or colonies which were much united, they were easier for them to make resistance. For example, during Maji resistance, whereby the southern Tanganyika societies, because they had much united, they decided to wage the war. That was the Maji War from 1905 to 1907 against the Germany rule. So other form is collaboration or alliance. So collaboration was a way of reacting against imposition of colonial rule, whereby African societies cooperated with European invaders. African societies used the method to impose colonial rule by welcoming or making cooperation with the colonialists against the indigenous or against their fellow enemies, and conducting treaties so as to get support and preserve their interest against their enemies. Therefore, collaboration simply means Africans welcome the Europeans in order to get their support. For example, Maasai, Buganda, and the Lords collaborated with the colonialists as the way to avoid their control. That is to say, they tried to defend themselves, to collaborate or to make a friendship with the Europeans so that they could be free from the colonial domination. So let us check those reasons why some African societies collaborated with the colonialists. So there were a number of factors which made some societies to make collaboration with the colonialists or Europeans. And number one was poor or weak military power. Some societies had poor military power compared to the colonialists. Therefore, they decided to cooperate with them in the opposing manner, since they believed that once they make collaboration with them, they could get some support. Also, poor leadership. Some societies in Africa decided to cooperate with the colonialists because they had poor or weak leaders who were not militarily confident to fight against the colonial rule. So instead of making reactions or resistance or making war against the colonialists, they now decided to collaborate with them, believing that once they collaborate with them, they could be free from the colonial rule. But another was to fight against their fellow Africans. Some African societies collaborated with the colonial rule invaders so as to get So they decided to fight against their fellow Africans or their fellow enemies who were strongly military. For example, Sangu, Bena, and Yao collaborated with the Germany against Mkwawa of Hehe. So this Mkwawa of Hehe seemed to be very actively or strongly against his fellow tribes. That's why they decided just to betray them and make collaboration or friendship with the German so that to defeat Mkwawa, who seemed to be very strong. Another was to get military or weapon support. African societies collaborated with the colonialists because they wanted to get strong military weapons to defend their territories. That, for example, Nambango, Mumia of Wanga, and the Kabaka Mutesa collaborated with the British to get strong armies which they could use in defending themselves from their fellow Africans, as well as to conquer their fellow Africans and strengthen their territory. Another point was fear and to promote peace and harmony. Some societies in Africa decided to cooperate with colonialists due to desire of maintenance of peace and harmony and avoiding warfare. Other point was ignorance. Ignorance of some African, especially rulers or leaders, who did not understand the mission or intention of colonialists through giving them gifts, fooled and persuaded them to sign bogus treaties. That is why they decided to collaborate with the Europeans or colonialists. For example, Chief Mangungo of Msovero, Kisao, signed a bogus treaty with Karl Peters so as he could cooperate with them without knowing the effect of doing it so. Again, King Lobengula of Shona and Ndebele signed bogus treaties with John Mofti. So they did it because of their ignorance, since they didn't understand what will be the effects? Another factor was natural problems such as calamities and disasters. In here, some societies in Africa suffered a lot with natural calamities such as drought, floods, hunger, and so forth, which made them weak politically, hence collaborating with the colonialists to get relief or assistance. For example, Maasai, Chaga, and Kikuyu, they made or they find themselves to have the decision of collaborating because of their natural problems like calamities and disasters. So they find themselves that the only solution were to collaborate with the colonialists. Other point was the role of missionaries. They played a great role to soften the African mind and hearts by preaching them to be humble and obedient to their masters. This lowered the African temper against colonial rule. That's why they found themselves to be under the colonial collaboration. So let us proceed with the resistances. African resistances against the imposition of colonial rule. But here we have the term resistance. So what does it mean by the term resistance? So resistance is the situation whereby Africans fought in order to oppose European invasion or colonial rule, or is the opposition against colonial rule or control. So these resistances were the reactions, responses of colonialists against the invasion of colonial rule, opposition of colonial rule or colonial control. And the Africans made resistance in different forms. Particularly, there were two forms of resistances or reactions against the colonial rule applied by Africans, namely active resistance and passive resistance. So let us start one after another in discussing them. Let us start with the active resistance. So active resistance is a form of resistance whereby Africans took arms to fight against the colonial rule. So in here, Africa decided directly to wage the war, active war against the colonial rule. Or active resistance is the one in which Africans wage war to oppose colonial rule by distracting European properties like farms, killing Europeans, and so on. For example, of African societies which applied active resistance against the colonial system were Nyamwezi under the leadership of Isike, Hehe under the leadership of Mkwawa, and Yao under Chief Machemba. So why some societies of Africa succeed or were able to apply active resistances? So there were a number of factors, or reasons which made them to succeed in applying active resistances. And those factors are as follows. The first factor was presence of strong or good leadership. For example, Samuel Tol and Mkwawa of Hehe. So these leaders organized their majority, organized their society, their community, so that they could fight strongly and actively against the colonial control. Hence, they succeed to apply active resistance. Another was a strong army. These societies which applied active resistance believed to have the strong army, which made them to fight effectively and actively against the colonial control. Another reason was strong unity among the people. unity among the people. Their people had much united, very united, and they used the different religious beliefs as well as norms to make them united. Again, they had good war techniques or good military techniques, which made them to maintain the colonial techniques of war. Another was the strong organizations or political systems. They had very organized. So their organization made them to fight actively against the colonial rule. For example, Hehe tribe, which believed to have the good political system under the leadership of Chief Mkwawa. Other factor was powerful socially and economically. They maintained socially and economically. That's why even the resistances did not take place at 1 year or 2 years. Some resistances were about 4, 3, up to 5 years. So because of this, made them to fight actively against the imposition of colonial rule. So these are about active resistances. Let us proceed with the passive resistances. So passive resistance is a form of resistance whereby Africans did not take army in opposing colonial rule or cooperating with the colonialists. On the other way, we may define passive resistance as is an armed or non-violent opposition against the colonial control by refusing to pay taxes, producing of cash crops, denied to work, and so forth. For example, societies which made or applied passive resistance were Pogoro, who refused to involve in colonial activities like cotton picking in southern Tanganyika. So in here, African reacted or resisted against the imposition of colonial rule or against colonial rule by only actions and not take a direct decision to wage war against them. But they just resisted or reacted through action, but not armed or violence. For example, they were given or they were ordered to make cultivation of such crops. While they denied. Instead of going to the farm to work for what they have ordered, they just slept at their homes. While once colonialists witnessed that those Africans have not attended to the farm, then they had asked themselves whether there is a problem. Then they discovered that Africans had resisted against their control. So why some African societies applied passive resistance and not active resistance? So there are factors. Let us discuss now those factors. So factor one was poor weapons. So this made them to fear against strong weapons of colonialists. That's why they decided to oppose the colonial control, but passively and not actively. Absence of a strong army or presence of weak army made some African societies to be afraid against colonialists and fight with them. Weak leadership, they had a weak leadership, and their leader did not maintain to organize them and make them united and confidently to fight against colonial control. Poor unity among the people or disunity amongst themselves. So this made them not to succeed to fight with the colonialists actively. Presence of natural calamities, for example, floods and drought. This acted as a barrier for them to fight actively against the colonial rule. Since these active resistances needed a lot of preparation in case of financial, socially, politically, as well as economically. Since they were in need of enough food, so that once they fight, the life go on. They were in need of those weapons or armies which could help them to resist or to fight strongly against the colonialists. Also weak social and political organizations. So these factors made them to fight passive, or to use passive resistance and not actively. Now let us proceed with the reasons why African societies fought against the imposition of colonial rule. Those factors for the African resistances against the imposition of colonial rule. As the title says, reasons why African societies fought against the imposition of colonial rule. So almost many African societies resisted against the imposition of colonial rule due to the following reasons. Reason one was to defend social and political sovereignty. Many societies in Africa decided to resist colonial rule because colonialists wanted to interfere their social and political power. So African chiefs or leaders such as Mkwawa, Samuel Tore, and Kabarega and so forth took army to fight against it in order to defend their social and political sovereignty, which were lost under the colonial control. Another factor was interference of trade. Africa resisted against the imposition of colonial rule because colonialists interfered with the African trade monopolies, which made Africans harsh towards the colonialist, hence resistances. And in here we may see that Africans had their own trade system, which based on barter trade, the exchange of goods for goods. But once colonialists came, witnessed that barter trade had no benefits to colonialists. That's why they decided to interfere with them and establish their new system of production, which had the benefits to them as the result of African resistances. Since Africans thought that their trade had their own benefits, and after the new that were established by colonialists, African started to be economically disturbed. That's why they decided to resist against the imposition of colonial rule. Other factor was cultural interference or interference of culture. Africa resisted against the imposition of colonial rule since colonialists wanted to interfere African culture, such as religion. Africans had their own religion, had their own norms, customs, traditions, but once colonialists came, they just wanted to demolish them and establish their new. For example, once colonialists came in Africa, they introduced the Christianity, which was different from the African traditions and beliefs. Even language, Africa had their own languages, those native languages like Kihehe, Chaga language, Makonde language. But once colonialists came in Africa, they introduced the English language, and the English language was later decided. So another point was land alienation, whereby colonialists alienated African land, especially those fertile land, and Africa remained landless as the result of African resistance. Forced labor, whereby Africans were forced to work in colonial farms as the result of African resistances. Introduction of taxation, whereby colonialists introduced different heavy taxes such as head tax, cattle tax, hat tax. Africans were not aware or were not ready to pay those taxes as the result of African resistances. Another factor was harsh rule or harsh treatment, since Africans were harshly treated by colonialists, punishing them. Africa were not ready to be colonized. This also was another factor. Again, beliefs of political and military strengths. Africans believed that they had strongly politically and military strengths. That's why they decided to react against the colonial rule. Other point was colonial social segregation and discrimination, by which Africans were segregated, were discriminated in social services, for example, getting education, getting health services, as well as the residence. And the other point was the alliance or collaboration between traditional enemies with the colonialists. So these are a number of factors which made African resistances or Africa to resist against the imposition of colonial rule. So then after we have a task which says why some African societies collaborated against the colonialists. Give 6 points. So you have to explain this question in terms of 6 points by providing vivid examples. So let us end here. We shall proceed with the other session. Thank you.
Purchase your tracks today.